Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today, we're putting on our investigative historian hats to examine a truly fascinating historiographical hypothesis from our source material regarding the geographic origins of Buddhism. We're going to dive deep into a very specific and honestly quite provocative claim, the idea that the historical narrative placing the Buddha's origins in India is actually a relatively recent construct, one that was deliberately engineered during the 19th century British colonial era. Because our source text argues that right before this shift happened, the accepted origin point was entirely different. Let's jump right in.
Here's our roadmap for today's analysis. We'll start with the early accounts of Ceylon, move on to the 1836 historiographical turning point, then discuss the relocation of sacred geography, and finally wrap up with the Jambudvipa textual contradictions.
All right, Part 1, Early Accounts of Ceylon. Let's see what the pre-1836 record actually looked like.
Okay, let's look at the first major piece of evidence. According to our source material, if you were sitting in a British classroom before 1836, your global history curriculum explicitly taught that Buddhism began in Ceylon, which is modern-day Sri Lanka, and not in India. The source highlights text from that specific era stating quite clearly that the religion originated in Ceylon, and from there it spread out to ancient Hindostan, to Tibet, and eventually all the way over to China and Japan. So the baseline historical understanding in the West, right before the mid-1800s, was very clearly focused on Sri Lanka.
Now, the timeline of how the British actually engaged with these local texts gets, well, incredibly mysterious. Back in 1809, Chief Justice Sir Alexander Johnson sent local historical manuscripts over to England to be translated. This effort culminated in 1833 when Edward Upham published his translation titled History and Doctrine of Buddhism. But then, just a single year later, Upham died under highly mysterious circumstances in his bathtub. And according to the source, with his death, that established narrative began to die too.
To really grasp why Upham's work matters so much to this hypothesis, listen to this exact quote from his 1833 book. Upham wrote, "Ceylon has been described by all writers as the most beautiful and celebrated of the Indian islands, which the Buddha has chosen to make the scene of his birth." The source argues that Upham translated these texts with genuine authenticity. And the inescapable conclusion you get from his translation was that the Buddha was born in Sri Lanka.
So, here is the million-dollar question. We have this widely accepted narrative, firmly documented in 1833 by a British translator. And then, following Edward Upham's highly suspicious death, the source argues that a deliberate, strategic shift in colonial historical documentation kicked off. The narrative just suddenly fractures. The question is, why?
That brings us right to Section 2, the 1836 historiographical turning point. Our source contrasts Upham's highly reverent 1833 account with a brand new translation that hit the scene just a few years later. In 1836, George Turner translated the Mahavamsa, but according to the analysis we're looking at, Turner's version drastically, and I mean almost unbelievably, changed the tone. The source claims Turner's translation was specifically designed to sever the cultural roots of the Sinhala people. It portrayed them historically as uncivilized, even astonishingly, referring to them as beasts or demons, who were just wandering aimlessly until foreign intervention, specifically King Ashoka and Prince Vijaya, came along to civilize them.
You have to ask yourself, why would a colonial power want to rewrite local history that drastically? Well, our source outlines a pretty calculated, strategic move by colonial entities. The ultimate goal was to sever the incredibly deep, powerful bond between the local temples and the public. By uprooting the sacred history of Buddhism from Sri Lanka, it made it far easier to eradicate local Buddhist influence. That, in turn, facilitated the work of Christian missionary societies and ultimately supported much tighter colonial administrative control. It's an age-old strategy, right? To control the people, you first have to control their sacred history.
Moving on to Section 3, Relocating Sacred Geography.
So, once the origin point was textually uprooted from Sri Lanka, it obviously had to be planted somewhere else. And over just a 60-year period, modern geographical consensus was entirely rewritten. Look at this timeline. In 1836, the exact same year Turner's work was happening, Alexander Cunningham identified Sarnath in India as the site of the first sermon. By 1880, Bodh Gaya was identified as the site of enlightenment. And in 1896, Alois Anton Führer identified Lumbini as the birthplace. The profound irony highlighted by the source here, the British were using Sri Lankan texts, like the Mahavamsa, as their blueprint to map out these sites in India because India itself actually had no surviving local texts documenting these locations.
Let's zoom in on 1896 and see how this builds, because the source heavily scrutinizes the identification of Lumbini. Alois Anton Führer claimed he found an Ashokan pillar proving Lumbini was the birthplace. However, the source points out that Führer's historical credibility has been widely criticized globally. He was actually notorious for forging archaeological claims and inscriptions for personal fame and financial gain. But despite his totally tarnished reputation, his discovery of Lumbini remains the accepted historical consensus today. Crazy, right?
To really drive home just how sudden and, frankly, foreign this geographic assignment was to India itself, the source brings up a wild historical anecdote. Mahatma Gandhi reportedly stated that he only learned about a Buddha existing in India after reading a book written by a British author, Edwin Arnold's 1879 poem, The Light of Asia. Think about that for a second. Imagine learning your own ancient history from a foreign colonial poet. The source argues this essentially proves that India had no prior local cultural memory of a native Buddha until British colonial literature introduced the concept to them. All right, Section 4, Jambudipa and Textual Contradictions. This is where the linguistic evidence gets incredibly interesting.
If you look at modern historical consensus, the ancient term Jambudvipa, or Dambadiwa, is universally linked to the Indian subcontinent. But our source argues that historically, India was actually referred to as Bharat, or the Mahabharata, by its own people. According to the source, early colonial texts explicitly use the word Jambudvipa to refer solely to Sri Lanka. Let's look at the proof they offer for this.
The source backs this up with specific 19th century British records. Take Reverend S.C. Millan's 1881 text, the Book of Proverbs. When discussing merchants traveling, the text literally places the word Ceylon in brackets right next to Jambudvipa. It reads exactly like this. Like a merchant who, having gone to Jambudvipa, Ceylon, the source argues that since no other country in the world was called Ceylon, it is undeniable that in the 1800s, British scholars absolutely knew Jambudvipa meant Sri Lanka.
It gets even more specific. The source points to Henry Charles's 1850 text, Ceylon and the Sinhalese. In this book, Charles describes a conference taking place at a location called Dambadiwa, and he explicitly notes that this location is about 50 miles east of Colombo. Colombo is, of course, the capital of Sri Lanka. You literally cannot be 50 miles east of Colombo and be in mainland India unless you're floating out in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So this drastically reinforces that geographic contradiction.
And if we go way back, long before the British even arrived, the source turns to the 5th century. The great Buddhist commentator Buddhaghosa, in his text the Samantapasadika, described Dambadiwa as an area bordered entirely by the sea. As the source rightly points out, mainland India is a vast subcontinent connected to Asia. It's certainly not bordered entirely by the sea. That description perfectly and exclusively fits an island nation like Sri Lanka.
And that brings us to our conclusion, reevaluating the record.
As we wrap up this explainer on these colonial-era document shifts, we really have to step back and ask ourselves what to make of these profound textual contradictions. The source has presented a very compelling, alternative view of how history was written. I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder. If a historical narrative, the very birthplace of one of the world's major religions, can be fundamentally rewritten and geographically relocated in just a few decades by colonial power seeking administrative control, how should we critically evaluate the global history we blindly accept as fact today? It's a huge reminder that history isn't just what happened, it's who held the pen. Thanks for joining me to unpack this source material today. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.